What happens when recovery looks stable, but the heart is still falling apart? In today's story, James is forced to choose between the life waiting outside and the woman lying silently beside him. Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet but deeply emotional chapter in James and Diep's journey, where love is tested not by crisis, but by the fear of becoming a burden. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. Morning came without noise, no alarms, no urgency. Just a thin line of pale light slipping through the half-open curtain, slowly touching the edge of the hospital bed. The room felt suspended in time, held together by the steady, quiet rhythm of the monitor beside Diep. She woke gently, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. Her body felt heavy, not with pain, but with exhaustion, the kind that settles deep and lingers. She took a slow breath, testing herself, then turned her head slightly. James was there. He sat in the chair beside her bed, his posture slouched in a way she'd never seen before. His arms were folded loosely, his head tilted forward, eyes closed. He hadn't even removed his jacket. One sleeve had slipped down his wrist, revealing a hand resting close to the edge of her bed, as if he had fallen asleep reaching for her. Diep watched him quietly. She had seen James tired before. Long days, late nights, travel, work. But this was different. This tiredness wasn't loud. It didn't complain. It didn't ask for rest. It simply existed, quietly etched into his face. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the soft beep of the monitor brought her back. She looked around the room. The white walls, the sterile calm, the faint smell of disinfectant. Everything felt too clean, too still, and suddenly the calm didn't comfort her anymore. It frightened her. The doctor arrived later that morning. The routine was familiar by now. Blood pressure, temperature, a quick look at the monitor, calm notes written on a chart. The doctor's voice was steady, practiced, reassuring without promising too much. Your condition is stable, the doctor said. Your body is responding well. We'll keep you here a few more days just to observe and make sure everything continues in the right direction. A few more days. James nodded immediately, relief crossing his face before he could stop it. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if he had been carrying a weight he hadn't acknowledged. Thank you, he said. The doctor smiled and left, the door closing softly behind them. James turned to Diep and squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You're doing better, he said quietly. I told you. She smiled back, small and careful, but inside her thoughts lingered on those words. A few more days. She glanced at the chair James had slept in, at the jacket he still wore, at the faint shadows beneath his eyes. How many nights had he stayed awake like this? James stepped out shortly after to get breakfast. I'll be back soon, he said, brushing her hair gently away from her face. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The room changed immediately. The silence grew thicker, heavier. Without James there, the space felt too large, too empty. Diep stared up at the ceiling, her eyes tracing the faint imperfections she had begun to memorize. The steady beep of the monitor filled the room. With nothing to distract her, her thoughts began to wander. What if this wasn't just a pause? What if her body didn't bounce back the way everyone hoped? She thought about James, how his life always seemed to be in motion. Even when he was still, there was always something ahead of him. Places to go, plans waiting to unfold, quiet dreams he rarely spoke about, carried with him everywhere. And now, he was here, because of her. Her chest tightened. She had never wanted to be someone's weight, never wanted to slow anyone down. And yet, here she was, lying still while the world waited outside the door. Her fingers curled into the sheet, gripping it as if it could hold her together. When James returned, the sound of the door opening pulled her back. He carried a simple tray, warm tea, plain food, nothing fancy. He smiled when he saw her awake. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" he asked gently. She shook her head. He set the tray down and sat beside her again, the chair creaking softly under his weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Diep looked at him. "James..." Her voice was quiet, hesitant, like she was testing the air between them. "Yeah?" He met her eyes. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "If I don't get better quickly," she asked, barely above a whisper, "does it make things harder for you?" The question landed between them, heavy and fragile. James froze. For a brief moment, Diep wished she could take it back. The silence stretched, and her gaze dropped to her hands, already bracing herself for an answer she wasn't sure she could handle. James inhaled slowly. "I am tired," he said. Her heart clenched, but then he continued. "I'm tired because I'm scared," he said quietly, "because I keep thinking about what could have happened, about how close I came to losing you." He looked at her fully now, his expression open, unguarded. "Taking care of you doesn't exhaust me," he said. "The fear does. The waiting does." He reached for her hand. "Losing you would." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away. This wasn't comfort wrapped in gentle lies. This was truth, spoken carefully, without drama. And somehow, it steadied her. They ate slowly. James fed her small spoonfuls, unhurried, attentive. The food grew cold between them, forgotten as they spoke in quiet fragments. At one point, he missed slightly, spilling a little on the blanket. Diep laughed softly, surprising both of them. "Careful," she teased weakly. He smiled, embarrassed. "I'm a little out of practice." For a moment, the hospital faded. No machines, no doctors, no waiting. Just two people sharing something ordinary. Diep leaned back against the pillow, her voice softer now. "I think I've been running for too long," she said. "I never really stopped to listen to my body." James didn't answer. He simply stayed beside her, his hand resting lightly over hers as if grounding both of them. The morning passed quietly. Outside the window, life continued, unaware, uninterrupted. Inside the room, everything slowed, and neither of them knew what the rest of the day would bring. The afternoon slipped by without announcing itself. The light outside the window shifted slowly, inch by inch, until it no longer reached the floor. The room grew quieter as the day leaned toward evening. Diep drifted in and out of sleep, her body finally allowing itself to rest in a way it hadn't for days. James stayed beside her. He barely moved, afraid that even the smallest sound might disturb the fragile calm that had settled between them. The steady rhythm of the monitor filled the room, constant and reassuring, yet impossible to ignore. It had become the background to everything, every thought, every breath. When his phone vibrated, the sound felt out of place. James looked down at the screen. His expression tightened slightly, a brief flicker of hesitation passing across his face. He glanced at Diep. She was asleep, her breathing slow and even, her hand resting loosely near the edge of the bed. For a moment, he considered ignoring the call. Then the phone vibrated again. Carefully, he eased his hand away from hers, standing slowly as if trying not to disturb the air itself. He leaned closer to her before stepping away, lowering his voice instinctively. "I'll be right back," he whispered, though she didn't stir. He stepped into the hallway and pulled the door almost completely closed behind him. Almost. Diep woke moments later, not because of pain or noise, but because something felt different. Her fingers twitched, instinctively searching for warmth that wasn't there. She opened her eyes and turned her head, noticing the empty chair beside her bed. James wasn't there. Her gaze shifted toward the door, left slightly open. Beyond it, she could hear voices, low, controlled, unfamiliar in tone. James's voice. She didn't want to listen. She told herself she shouldn't. But the quiet of the room gave her nothing else to hold on to. She caught fragments of the conversation drifting through the narrow opening. Words without full context, but heavy enough on their own. Responsibilities, delays. Something that had already been pushed aside once. Something that couldn't wait much longer. The world outside the hospital was still moving. It hadn't slowed down for her recovery. It hadn't paused for her heartbeat. It was still reaching for James, pulling him in direction she couldn't follow right now. Her chest tightened as she stared at the ceiling. When James returned, he closed the door gently behind him and walked back to her side. His face was calm, carefully composed. Too composed. "You're awake," he said softly. She nodded. "Who was that?" He hesitated just briefly. "Work," he said. "Nothing important. Nothing you need to worry about." She smiled faintly and turned her head toward the window. She didn't press further. She didn't want to hear more than she already had. But the thought stayed with her. Evening settled in quietly. The hallway lights dimmed, softening the edges of the room. Nurses passed by less frequently now, their footsteps lighter, their voices lower. The hospital seemed to exhale as night took over. James shifted in his chair, stretching his shoulders. The exhaustion he'd been holding back all day finally surfaced. His movements were slower, heavier, as if the weight of the last few days had finally caught up with him. Diep noticed immediately. "You should go home tonight," she said. The words came out calmly, almost too calmly. James looked at her, surprised. "What?" "You haven't slept properly," she continued. "You need rest. I'll be fine here." He studied her face, searching for something beneath the surface. He saw it then. The guilt she hadn't voiced, the fear she was trying to manage on her own. "I don't want to go home," he said quietly. "You can't stay here forever," she replied. The words weren't meant to hurt. They weren't meant to push him away. But once spoken, they lingered in the air between them, heavier than she had intended. James didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, as if he was absorbing something deeper than the words themselves. The silence stretched. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to the tension filling the room. Each beep marked time passing, time neither of them could control. James stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the city lights had begun to glow, distant, scattered, alive with movement. Life continued beyond the glass, unaware of the fragile moment unfolding inside. When he turned back, his voice was steady. "I'm not here because I have to be," he said. "I'm here because I choose to be." Diep looked at him, startled by the clarity in his tone. "You don't get to decide when I leave," he continued, "and you don't get to turn this into something you're doing to me." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm not staying out of obligation," he said more gently now. "I'm staying because this is where I want to be, with you." The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It didn't feel like distance. It felt like something had finally been said out loud. Diep turned her face away, blinking back tears. She hadn't realised how heavy the fear had become until it began to loosen its grip. The fear of slowing him down. The fear of becoming something he'd have to leave behind. "I don't want to be the reason you stop," she whispered. James stepped closer. "You're not stopping me," he said. "You're the reason I stay." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt something inside her soften. Night settled in fully. Diep eventually drifted into sleep again, exhaustion claiming her gently this time. Her hand moved unconsciously, gripping the edge of James's jacket as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. James stayed. He sat beside the bed, watching the numbers on the monitor rise and fall in steady patterns. From the outside, everything looked calm, stable, reassuring. Her condition was improving, her breathing even, her face peaceful in sleep. But James knew recovery wasn't just measured in numbers. It lived in the fears left unspoken, in the guilt carried quietly, in the choices he was making without knowing where they would lead. He leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the monitor. tomorrow would come with new questions, and neither of them was ready for the answers yet.
Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.